Welcome back to episode 8 of What the Fundraising. This podcast is for impact leaders and change makers who are looking to fundamentally change the way they lead and fundraise. Today, I'm interviewing Duke Stump, an inspired protagonist who loves to build cultural bonfires and explore what it means to be human. His diverse background includes 15 plus years at Nike, the CMO at Seventh Generation, first expert in residence on sustainability at Presidio Graduate School, curator and co-host of the Do Lectures, EVP of Brand and Community at Lululemon, and the first CMO at Lime. And he's currently the founder of Bonfire With Soul, an online course introducing a new school of thought for business. I'm actually inside Bonfire With Soul right now, and I cannot recommend this course enough for every single aspiring change maker. In fact, when we jump on this call, I get so swept up in the conversation with Duke that I never actually officially start the episode or introduce him. Whoops. We pretty much right off start talking about the difference between the nonprofit and the for-profit sector, the predictors of success, and maybe where they're not so different after all. We talk about what it means to build true companies, organizations for good, and to partner with folks in an aligned and mutually beneficial way. There are so many things to take away from this. Duke has these amazing pillars inside Bonfire With Soul, and we talk about some of my favorite ones today. Trust breeds magic, honesty over perfectionism, and inspiration versus desperation. Each lesson, each principle has so much for us all to learn from. So let's not wait a second longer and let's dive in. Good morning.
How are you?
I'm good. You know, I feel like I've already been with you for an hour because I've been binging some more videos from Bonfire.
Oh, my condolences.
Oh my gosh. Are you kidding? I have cried during so many of them. I can't even tell you. Like I was like, okay, Mallory, like you're definitely going to cry on this podcast episode. That's okay. Just get ready for it. No, it's, yeah, I don't know yet. Like, I don't even know yet. I just feel like it's hitting on so many things I've wondered about and thought about and just deeply hope everyone in business takes forever and ever. Yeah, and I'm just so grateful for what you're teaching. So thank you.
I appreciate you sharing. I mean, it's been a learning journey for me just to see how people have received or responded. And I think what's nice is it hasn't been the same for everybody in terms of their takeaways are all different. But yeah, at the end of the day, I don't think it's really a business course or adventure. I think it's something different, but it's been fun for me. It was hard to put it out there. It's normally not my nature to do stuff like that. So it's been rewarding and fun.
Yeah, really, really cool to hear about your like own journey with public speaking throughout it and the way you weave like parenting into different stories. And I mean, I think what you're talking about, and this is sort of what I am constantly wondering is like, okay, what is business? What is the nonprofit sector? Does it have to be these boxes that we've traditionally made them out to be? And you share so many stories like, you know, throughout it too. And so it's like, okay, maybe it's not a business course in terms of what's being taught traditionally in college, but like, should it be a business course? And isn't that the better question?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's whether it's nonprofit or for-profit. I mean, I really believe that financials are not a predictor of success, and but they're a function of doing all these other things. And these other things, I think, are applicable to nonprofit. They're applicable to for-profit. And it's, as I shared at the beginning of the course, like I'm obsessed with burning dogma of business, regardless of what type of business it is, because I think we limit possibility by a lot of our actions. And so it's been. And it goes against the grain. So for some people, it rubs people wrong. They're like, that's not how you do bit. Like if I talk to Silicon Valley friends, they're like, what are you doing? And I'm like,
yeah,
I'm sharing a different path.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's what we really even focus on, like during this conversation.
Sure.
Like, what does it look like to sort of trust doing things a way that aren't the like prescriptive way? Because I feel like that's like the overarching theme that I'm kind of walking away with from all the principles is like so many of them require a level of saying, you know what, those metrics might be known as the indicator of this outcome because that's been the way on a macro level we can calculate and we just desperately want prediction and like understanding. And I feel like so much of what you're teaching is like out of your head, into your body, like into like community, listen. And like when all these things are in flow, of course, those other things are going to happen. But what does it take to let yourself like let go of some of that other stuff?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I share in the course, like I love the natural world. And the natural world creates the conditions conducive to life because it's always attuned. It's locally attuned and responsive. And I feel like we become lazy. We defer to methods of predictive or measurable or tangible things. And then we forget the ability to see all these other things because we're not attuned. We're just like, okay, we grab input and then we react. And I feel like what's lost is when you really, really believe something. Like when we had Pete Fairley the other day, who's the, Oscar-winning director on, and he said, I've been told no so many times on scripts and things, but if I fundamentally believe it, then I just do it. And it doesn't mean it's always works out, but he goes against the grain. And, I normally talked about my own experiences, but the one I love, the story that I love is that when they were first doing Seinfeld as a pilot, it got terrible reviews. And I think it was one of the producers like, I don't care. I don't care. We're going to do Seinfeld. And so could you imagine like, if Seinfeld never existed, I mean, it was like one of the most iconic shows in TV history. And so I just think we've lost the art of serendipity. I think when we dull people's like own radar, I would much rather like be wrong based on something I fundamentally believe in versus deferring or defaulting to this like mechanical rote way of doing things. So
what point, and maybe you talk about this in the course and I just haven't seen this part, but was there like a noticeable moment in your career when you sort of gave yourself permission to, I mean, you started at Nike in that program where it sounds like they really fostered kind of a level of creativity or, thinking outside the box. So maybe it wasn't something you feel like you had to like kind of unwire, but I'm just, I think about so many people who have done things the textbook way and what it would take for them to give themselves permission to step back from some of those indicators and learn how to move forward in like a fundamentally different way.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it started, there's like a number of different points, but one of them I talked about in the course is I was at university as a philosophy major. And I take that back out. I love philosophy as an economics major. And I'm taking this philosophy class and I have to do this basically comparison between Plato's Republic and Socrates. And I remember like, I just can't do this. This feels really boring, but I know I got to play by the rules to get the grade. And so for whatever reason, which was outside of my normal demeanor, I'm like, I'm going to write a play. And they're going to be in a pub in a local bar in Burlington, Vermont. And I'm just going to share this like dialogue between the two of the Plato and Socrates having a beer. And I remember it felt so good writing it. I was like, it was freeing. And then I remember I handed it in. And that once I handed it in, it was like, oh, snap. Like I just totally messed up. I'm going to get an F. And when I remember like I was having heart palpitations when the paper came back and the teacher gives it to me, it was like, I got an A or A minus, whatever. And I just remember him saying, thank you. Like I read, hundreds of papers or hundreds of documents. And this was just really refreshing and creative. And you captured the spirit of them in a unique way. And I remember at that moment, it's like, oh, we're right. Like I'm going to play, like I can go outside the lines here a little bit. And then getting to Nike was like, there were no rules. I think that place, especially in the early 90s, it was a magical time in that, my first job, I'm early 20s, I'm in LA, my boss was my age, she's in Portland. And she's like, hey, just enhance the connection between our brand and this community. And I'm like, well, what else? Like, you got anything else to tell me? She's like, no, just go out there. And of course, like, I'm doing some things that are just off the wall bad, but then I'm doing things that do well. And I was like, God, I love this place. And I think what's lost in a lot of business is being empowered. And that's was the greatest gift, is they're like, hey, we trust you. Go out and do what you got to do. And I was like, okay. But so I think for me, I was fortunate to grow up as a first big job in a culture that was like, we're going to burn dogma for our daily breakfast. Like, that's what we do. Like, there really were no rules. Even in the idea of predictive things, you would do ideas not based off ROI or whatever. You were like, what is someone going to feel once they've seen this, whatever you created? That was the question we'd ask. What do you want someone to feel? And that was the barometer of whether you're successful or not. Once you created a campaign or a product or whatever, and it's like, did people feel that? And like, yeah, I'm like, okay, that's good. Versus, hey, what was like, the CAC or the marginal CAC or whatever the language we use today around performance and growth marketing.
So interesting to hear you say that, because this is something I think about in fundraising a lot, that even just asking ourselves the question differently like that is actually the fundamental question. I do a event planning boot camp, and the fundamental question I walk people through is, what does this person feel? Like, what do your corporate sponsors feel at that event? What do your donors feel at that event? What do your board members feel at that event? And I kind of walk them through trying to experience, they simulate it in their mind, what those people are experiencing. They walk into the room, what's there? Who are they greeted by? What do they say? What are they proud of? Who do they want to sit with? And I never, so much of what I created in my course was like, what do I think about when I'm helping an organ, right? Because I wanted to help people be able to do, without hiring me one-on-one, to be able to use the practices I used. And so I was like, okay, well, what do I do? Like, what are the questions I ask myself? And I found that so many of them went back to that. And it's so interesting because I think that a lot of, even the clients that I've worked with, it kind of freaks them out a little bit that I'm not talking about metrics, or I'm not talking about how many silent auction items they're going to have at the table. And I'm not talking about, and because I'm like, that's going to happen. But if we design first around the feelings of what we want to build, the other stuff is going to fall into place. And we're not actually going to waste so much time talking about whether you have like 40 silent auction items or 50, because that's not really the point, right? The point is this whole piece that no one's even asking. So I just love that is like, it kind of comes back to that fundamental question.
Yeah, I mean, one, I applaud the fact that you recognize that, because, and I love the idea of like, anytime you're doing something, it's like Peter Block would say, create connection before content. And I think when you try to understand what's the feeling you're trying to emote, it's your behavior and actions and how you're curating something shift. And recently I was speaking to this team at Microsoft, and I was talking to them, and my first question is, what after we have our talk, like, what do you want people to feel? And so then I'm like, oh, okay, cool. I can create around that. And, versus like just give a talk and then not even be attuned to what type of vibration or verb that I was trying to come from it. And I think it's bold because, and it's scary, and it's bold because you're venturing into the unknown, and it's scary for people because they're like, well, no, like, how is this going to go? And to your point, if someone's like, no, like, is it 40 auction items? Like, yeah. So yeah. I love that. And I just think it is like, sometimes what's the question we're asking is such an important piece. And yet, that's why I think the art of inquiry is also like a lost art, just questions. We just make statements most of the time.
Yeah, well, that is like my like life mantra is like get curious. Like anytime I feel myself jumping to judgment or something, I'm just like, okay, you're not being curious enough. You're gonna lose something big here. And yeah, I think that has also been something that I've just watched like serve me and the people around me. I'm curious like about, so I think about, I mean, one of the underlying questions I am curious about your take on is like, the role of the nonprofit sector versus business. Because when I hear you talk about what businesses can be and what, and the types of businesses I know you've been involved in on boards and as an advisor, when I graduated college, I think I believed that in order to make a social impact, the nonprofit sector was where I needed to be. And I knew that that was what I wanted. And so I never really considered that business could be a model for good in the way that you talk about it. And so, maybe we actually go there and then I can ask my other question after. But what do you think about that? Like, how do these sectors like complement each other? Do they need to be fundamentally different in certain ways? What do you think?
I mean, I don't think we need a fence between for-profit and nonprofit, truthfully. Like, I think you can blur the lines, and I do believe business can be a force of good. Obviously, most nonprofits are a force of good. But to me, it's more important for a nonprofit to blur the lines, because sometimes when you're a nonprofit, you operate from a place of scarcity. You're like, oh, we're a nonprofit. Meanwhile, businesses over there being bold and brash and doing all these things, and nonprofits are like, hey, we're nonprofit. Like we're you live with a set of limitations. Like I'm on the board of the school here, Oak Grove School in Ojai, and it's a nonprofit. And I have to say, like, the head of school she's badass. I mean, she's like, no, man, we're going to be a force of change in the world, and this is how we're going to do it. And even fundraising, all those things, like, but it's never from a place of scarcity. It's actually from a place of abundance, in terms of just recognizing like this, wow, imagine if we could do this, like what living possibility. And so I think a lot of businesses are realizing the beauty of standing for something meaningful in the world. I still think there's a lot of brands that shouldn't even exist in businesses, whatever. But I think if you look at the ones, like here's an example, just because I share this in the course. I'm going to school, University of Vermont. I'm taking the economics class, learning about business, and I'm watching Ben and Jerry's down the street just crush everything I'm learning. I'm like, is that business? Because what I'm learning is not the same thing. And they taught me early on, though, like, man, you can stand for something. They were standing for social issues that were not nearly like in the early 80s. It was like nobody was doing that, but they were now. And even today, I think they got their voice back again. And so I think that's a great example of, hey, you can make a great product, ice cream, and really with the magic is like standing for something meaningful in the world. And I just, once again, I sometimes find it is we minimize possibility by saying whether we're a for-profit or nonprofit, because at the end of the day, I think you're both trying to really do the same thing.
Well, you just walked right into my follow-up question, or actually just kind of gave me the answer, which is exactly that. Like when I hear you talk about what it takes to approach business differently, or like with that creativity, I'm like, there's an abundance there that you don't see in the nonprofit sector. There's like a safety of belief that it's going to be okay, that nonprofits just don't hold. And I'm trying to really understand what fundamentally that is, because it's not about the amount of money in the bank account. Like, I think what's really interesting to me, having grown up in the nonprofit sector and constantly being asked about our budget and our reserves, 6 months reserves and kind of all these things that I was, hounded about when I was running organizations. And then I watched COVID hit, and I watched all these huge, mid-sized, small businesses have no reserves. And I didn't even realize that. And I was sort of like, wait a second, what? don't they have at least 6 months reserve? How is this happening? Why is it just the nonprofit sector? And so I feel like I'm grappling with this fundamental question around both in practice, but beliefs. Like, how are we viewing money so differently that gives us either the catalyst to create bigger change or holds us back from it?
Yeah, well, if you think about it, what you just talked about, I mean, cash flow, whether you're a for-profit or nonprofit, is, well, unless, there's obviously a Silicon Valley model where it's just like you can just raise money forever and never make a profit. Right? I'd like to think for those businesses that understand, are more diligent around cash flow, it's a real issue whether you're for a for-profit or nonprofit. Even when I was in public companies, it's like you're looking at how much, you're always looking at money piece. I think what's interesting to me is just how you approach then your business, meaning if a nonprofit started from a white canvas and it just was like, okay, forget any limitations or things of scarcity. And we just said, okay, you focus more on what's the impact. I always ask that burning question, what does the world need most that we're most uniquely qualified to deliver? And then you lived into that without limitations, knowing full well you've got to actually have money or cash flow and reserves and all those things. I see the nonprofits spend a lot more time on that. And I think it comes from desperation, whereas business comes from inspiration. It's like, okay, no, we're going to do this. And I just think there's a mindset for me that I see around nonprofits more often than not that just operates from a place of scarcity. It's like, and their nonprofits and for-profits really aren't that much different at the end of the day. I guess that's the way I look at it. But it's an interesting challenge, but also it's an amazing opportunity, I think, for nonprofits, truthfully.
Yeah, I'm curious, and I don't know how much experience you've had with this in your different roles, but I'm curious about the way that shift in mindset then can impact like strategic partnership opportunities, like when nonprofits and for-profits come together to run like a campaign together. Is it harder for for-profit companies to partner with nonprofit companies because of that like fundamental mindset difference? Or is it that nonprofits aren't coming? Because one of the things I've seen in my work that's just was kind of the impetus of me creating my course was that when I went to for-profit companies and was like, I think there's something really big we could do together, they were like, talk to me. And I spent 13 years being like, hey, will you give like $2,500 to like our gala and like be a sponsor, like pretty please, because we're doing this really good work. And then the moment I shifted to like, I think we have a mutual goal and I think there's something really significant we could do if we come together. It was like that tiny shift shifted everything. And so it also has me thinking about, I really believe that cross-sector partnerships can be incredibly powerful. But I am wondering, like, what are the kind of language barriers or mindset barriers that make it hard for us to like sit at the same table and think really creatively together?
Yeah, I mean, you said actually a number of really interesting things. I mean, one is going back to the natural world, things thrive based on mutualistic partnerships. So one party you're not taking from the other party, you're both mutually benefiting. And I think if something's positioned in that respect as a for-profit business, you're like, yeah, I'll listen. It's going to make me better. And there's going to be this mutualistic partnership. And I think that's such a key piece to it. I also think it's how you approach it. Like when you say, I got something big, and like, of course, like people are like, yeah, but if there's like a timid nature to it, like, hey, what do you think? Like maybe it's like, whatever. But I also think at the end of the day, everything's about trust. And so whether or not you really trust the other partner, but I think companies in today's world, I say great brands are bonfires with soul and they stand for something bigger than their product. I think everyone's striving to get to that place for the most part. They're not exactly sure. I think partnerships are a really amazing way, as long as it's authentic and genuine and real. We've also seen a lot of partnerships where you're like, that's gross. Like it's like you could tell it's just a transaction. It's not a deep relationship. And so But I think anytime you're a business, a company, and there's a nonprofit that wants to partner, I think it's how it's delivered. What's the point of view around it? Is it a, 1+1=11 type thing? And that'll obviously, I think, get a lot. And there's like real, I think, like, what do you think is a great example right now of a company, a for-profit and a nonprofit partnership that you admire right now?
Gosh, it's a really good question. I think though, I think they're actually probably ones we don't know about, because I think sometimes it's a really good question. One of the ones I talk about a lot for the nonprofit sector people, to sort of show them kind of how valuable they are. A big part of the way that I talk about nonprofits showing up to the table with for-profit companies is like, I have them do this process called asset mapping, where I have them basically list out all the assets of their organization that go way beyond their program themselves or their services. Because one of the things I have found is that when I've talked about scarcity or abundance, it's so hard for these nonprofit professionals to go from scarcity to abundance. I mean, abundance feels so far away. So for months, I was like, okay, what's in the middle? What's in the middle? What's the first step towards shifting out of scarcity? And so I started to think about, okay, assets. And so I have them write down everything from like their email list size to thought leaders on their board of directors and, all these different things. And so then when they're showing up to these conversations with these for-profit businesses, they're talking about their organization with all of these assets. So one, it helps them kind of strategically align better, because they're like, okay, this brand wants access to this audience. We have that. And so maybe let's figure out a way to do a campaign together, but also just changes the energy of the fundraiser, right? Because they feel like they're sitting at that table with something really valuable. So from that perspective, like one of the partnerships I talk about a lot is like Disney and Make-A-Wish, because, that is like a strong for-profit, nonprofit strategic partnership that clearly elevates Disney's brand, right? They do commercials together. Now they have a shared product line together. There's clearly, and so for nonprofit professionals to see, like, look at the value add of Make-A-Wish to Disney, right? But I don't know what that partnership looks like behind closed doors. I don't know how good it feels to make a wish, right? So I feel like probably the best ones are the ones that we don't even necessarily know about, but they're elevating the work of the nonprofit organization and the ecosystem around them, supporting the business, but in a way that feels so authentic and aligned that we don't even see the cross-sector partnership there.
Yeah, actually, that's fascinating. That's probably true, actually. It's interesting too. I love the asset idea, by the way. That's brilliant. It reminds me, there's a teacher, she teaches the entrepreneurial program at Stanford. I think her name's Tina Seelig. And she tells her class, hey, you have, we're gonna do a project. You have and you get in teams, and you have $5 and then 5 minutes to present. How are you going to take this $5 and make it bigger? And so teams go off and they buy a bike pump and they pipe, they spend a day doing biking, pumping up tires for people on their bikes, whatever. And then there was one group though that was like, hey, what's our most valuable asset in this? And they were like, it's not the $5, it's the 5 minutes. So they sold the 5 minutes to Frog Design, which is a design firm that could use that 5 minutes to recruit the students. Mm-hmm. And so rather than, I don't remember the exact number, but they blew away everyone else's because they recognized what their assets were. And, and I think getting people to see the assets is actually that's a really brilliant thought, actually. Because I think sometimes that scarcity is also just seeing like, oh, we just do this one thing and then we're limited. But if you can define that asset mapping like you suggested, that's damn cool, actually. I might have to add that to my repertoire.
Do it. Yeah. And then they have like 200 things. What the coolest part is watching them look at this list of things and just being like, wow, like, the value, because you're right. And I love that example because so we just like, I feel like the the cognitive shortcut is to be like, money is the thing with value. Why? Like, and so like take a step back. Okay, money is one piece of this puzzle, and sure, put that on the, for-profits asset map, no problem. But that's not the standalone, position.
Yeah, I think that actually really is brilliant. And I think that's applicable to actually any organization, for-profit, nonprofit, just as like that the idea of asset mapping. It's interesting, really interesting.
I'm in the process, and by that I mean in my brain, of I was talking to someone recently and they were like, I heard you're thinking about asset mapping from the for-profit side, which I am. I'm trying to think about how a for-profit would asset map to then identify the right nonprofit partnerships to them. Like, how can they both look at sort of like their assets and their needs and basically be able to map against a nonprofit asset map to say, that's the right type of partnership for us. And the person was like, can I see like where you are in that work? And I'm like, no, because it's all in my head. I was like, but pretty soon I will have something come out, I promise.
Just don't have anybody bump you so you forget it.
But yeah, I mean, it definitely is something that, it's interesting because I think sometimes when I talk about it, people are like, oh, she's speaking with too much kind of like business language, or like I love the way you talk about mutual benefit. I think I might steal that because I often talk about like win-win partnerships. And sometimes it can make nonprofit professionals, I think, feel a little bit uncomfortable. Like, why are we thinking about the win of the business? And I'm like, well, because the whole ecosystem being successful is important. But, there is this sort of belief system, or like maybe old school belief system of nonprofits kind of coming to the table just with what they need, and that people should just give them what they need because they're a nonprofit and to help them fill the gap. And so I love thinking about, what does it take for us to really align around shared goals and the value we each bring to the table in order to achieve a shared goal that we have. And for nonprofit professionals to believe that for-profits share a lot of the goals that they have.
Yeah. So I was part of this thing called Biomimicry. I was a part of the nonprofit Biomimicry Institute for 8 years. And it's basically how you look at nature as a mentor. And it's founded by Janine Benyus. And in my Bonfire With Soul course, she talks one of the podcasts, and she says something that really has resonated with me. She says, definition of what success is in nature is different than business. And she said, what she meant by that is, she said, in nature, nothing survives by itself. There's an interdependence on all these other things. And with that comes the ability to create conditions conducive to life and thrive and flourish. Whereas business, it is true generally, for-profit, nonprofit, you're like, I'm going to go it alone. And that actually is counter to how the natural world would do it. And I do think, there's just, for me, I think the beauty of partnerships and collaborations they're rich because, one, you're bringing also a diversity of different thought in, which I always think helps. You can get out of your own monoculture of thinking. But to me, it's so much is about partnerships and this mutualistic approach, in a way that, once again, both parties benefit without detracting from the other.
And I feel like you talk about 3 principles. Well, trust in Bonfire, trust is really woven in everything. I feel like you were telling stories about building trust almost in every module, even though there are some that are specifically talking about that. But like trust, honesty, perfection, those have a deep relationship with like building partnerships. So what do you think about that? Like, what's the relationship between maybe even perfection and trust? Because I feel like a lot of nonprofit professionals, when they think about building strategic partnerships, their perfectionist hat goes on hard.
Yeah.
And I believe it's actually the biggest barrier to them building deep, lasting strategic partnerships. But it feels terrifying to them to even hear that from me.
I think in the spirit of trust, one is there's so much beauty in letting go. Look at it at a personal level. If you're in a personal relationship, there's no trust. That is a hard, rough road, and I'm not sure anybody is feeling really good in that. But when there's just effortless loyalty and trust, then you're not putting your mind on things that are like negative. You're actually probably more than likely putting your energy on all these things around possibility and connection. Then when I get to the idea of perfection, well, I've lived it straight out. Like we had the Nike labor crisis in '95, which truthfully was a horrific time for a lot of different reasons. But one of the worst things was just how the company actually handled that. It was like, okay, hire the biggest PR firms. We're going to do damage control. And a lot of people were telling Phil Knight at the time, like, hey, we just need to be transparent. And he even says his biggest regret was he didn't listen to his own team on how to handle it. And so it, in many ways, just made what it was that level to be perfect actually just inflamed the situation that still exists today. Like when you say child labor, sadly, a lot of times people think of Nike. I then went to Nike to seventh generation, which was redefining corporate responsibility. And I remember we'd mess up on something, or like someone looked at one of our ingredients and there was a substrate that actually had been created that wasn't good. And I remember Jeffrey Hollander, the founder, was like, we got to tell everybody. My first reaction was like, what? Like, we're doing what? He's like, oh yeah, like transparency is everything. Just be honest. And we would tell the world like, hey, this is going on. And everyone, next thing you know, like our business grew. And so I think this idea of honesty versus perfection, one, it's actually really liberating for the individuals to not live under this cloud of trying to be perfect, because that's super hard. But then I think I just think enhances relationships when there's just a deep sense of vulnerability and honesty. It's like, yeah, this is what happened. This is where we're at. I think people appreciate that sense of humanness, truthfully.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like something I say to fundraisers a lot is like, look, if you start with your perfectionist hat on, which like I did for 13 years, right? I was just like the fundraising robot I thought I was supposed to be, and saying all the right things and doing all the right things. And, but then what it meant was that you always have to stay that way. You're like kind of all of a sudden occupying, you're being this person who isn't truly authentically you, because you can't be authentic and perfect because nobody's actually perfect. So even in that kind of adoption, you're losing yourself, and then whatever you're doing isn't going to feel good there.
So why do you think nonprofits take the position that they need to be perfect? Because they view themselves as less than, or? Yeah.
Oh gosh. I think there's probably multiple reasons for it. I think one is that, one of the things that I am starting to kind of research on my own is the way that scarcity mindset actually shifts our decision making. Like it actually affects our cognitive ability. It changes our brain. There's a lot of research around it, not in relation to nonprofit professionals, looking more at things like scarcity in situations of poverty and things like that. But I do think that the scarcity mindset is part of what breeds the perfectionism, right? Like if there isn't enough of something, then the way for me to get my share is to be error-free, right? That I'm going to sort of risk any access, or I'm going to risk any, every meeting, every relationship feels like this like last shot kind of, or like your only shot. And as opposed to there being so many people out there, so many companies to partner with, so many, and I think I've said this to you before, like I do not believe that the nonprofit kind of market size is a fixed market size at all. It's like, okay, sure, foundations give away a certain amount every year. Other than that, building partnerships with marketing departments, that's not even factored into philanthropic giving. Individuals, how much do you inspire them to get involved? There's not some market share, but the wiring is that there's $5 in the bowl, and whoever reaches fast enough at just the right angle, is going to get it, and everyone else isn't. So I think that's part of it. I think the other, I think scarcity is like a financial construct, but also an emotional one, right? That like they are less than, they're coming to the table without the thing of value. They're the one in need of something, asking for something. So I think that creates a lot of it. And I just think we're so afraid to be fully seen, particularly when we need help. However we view that, we're just so afraid to be visible. And maybe because we're afraid of hearing that our organization isn't refined enough for that investment, because then we take it to mean that we've done something wrong. Yeah, part of it probably is that the causes that professionals are committed to feel like a part of them. And so it's almost like hearing, somebody doesn't like your nonprofit. I've heard this from clients before. I'm like, look, not everyone's going to like your nonprofit. No problem. Like, you're never going to find the right people unless you like are who you are, and they're like, but like, then that means they don't like me. And it's just like, I think it like hits on our like deepest human desire to just feel like loved and appreciated, and that what we're doing is like the right thing. And when something indicates that maybe it wasn't the right pitch, or it wasn't the right partnership, or it wasn't good enough in this way, we then build these structures and systems to avoid any other interaction like that.
Do you find that there's like a traditional path or trajectory for someone who enters a nonprofit versus a business? Meaning, is there like a mindset?
Well, there are some characteristics that I have found to be really true. So in my executive coach certification program was through an organization called IPEC. And one of the tools that I'm trained on is this thing called the Leadership Index Assessment. And it's an attitudinal assessment that basically evaluates sort of your current level of your current resonating energy level, like how you sort of normally operate, and then what happens when you're triggered into stress. And there are these 7 levels that go from level 1 is like, they talk about catabolic energy. Level 1 is like martyrdom, victimhood. Level 2 is anger. Level 3 is rationalization. 4 is helper energy. 5 is win-win energy. 6 is joy. And 7 is enlightenment, right? So you can sort of feel how from like victimhood to enlightenment, right? There's this whole spectrum of human experience and leadership styles. And I've taken those and turned them into the 7 styles of fundraising. But I've done this assessment now with hundreds of fundraisers. And what's really interesting, this is the first time I'm sharing this actually, is that 98% of the assessments that I've done, the primary resonating energy level with nonprofit leaders is 4, which is the helper energy. And the primary level when they're triggered into stress is 1, which is victimhood and martyrdom.
Wow.
And then they have a really strong 3 typically, which is rationalization. So there's this loop that I see with all of them where they're like helper, 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 helper. Someone says no, someone doesn't respect me, deep into paralysis, victimhood, martyrdom, being kind of at the effect of their life. Then they rationalize that, well, they just don't understand, or they just don't know what we really need, or they don't, and they rationalize their way right back up to 4. And then they just keep themselves in this loop, right? And there's little access to win-win at 5 and little access to joy at 6. And so I think one of the things that I explore with a lot of my clients is like, okay, so first of all, this assessment is not like, this is who you are forever and ever. This is like how you're showing up right now. It can shift. Right. And so a lot of what I talk about with my clients is, okay, so you have a strong level 4 helper energy. And they'll be like, yeah, being helpful is like a strong core value of mine. And I'm like, okay, is it a chosen value? Is it a conscious-based value, or is it a fear-based value? And they're like, what are you talking about? Like, it's my value. And I'm like, okay, but does it come from a place of, I want to be this? Or does it come from a place of, if I'm not helpful, then I'm unlovable, then I'm not enough, then people won't want me here. And that has been such a kind of like a eye-opening experience, how many people that is true for, that it comes from a fear-based place, like they needed to be helpful, right? Or out, like I'm the oldest of 4 girls, right? Like I totally grew up believing that like my value was deeply linked to how helpful I was, you
Mm.
know? And like, and how much I made things easier for the people around me and how little space I took up myself. And the pattern of this, like the pattern in seeing this in my clients is like, okay, so it's not that level 4 is a bad place to be. It's a great, like pretty anabolic place to live. But if it's not coming from a place of choice, then it keeps us in this scarce, like that, then it's all scarcity.
Yeah, it's actually, I talk a little bit about this in the course, this idea of like, for me, it's a practice. Am I working from inspiration or desperation? And I try just to notice it. And I always think of, well, there's the Buddhist way, but even Viktor Frankl would say, there's that magic space between stimuli and response. And what is your chosen response? And I've seen, I guess, one thought and then a question is, I just think our chosen response around something is so important. Like, I mean, when I was at Lime, that's the micromobility company, we were supposed to launch in Germany. We had 5 weeks. It was a rush. And there was just like really frenetic behavior. And it was like, oh my God, we're going to blow it. And I'm like, my whole thing was like, what if we actually nailed this? Like how could we like look at this from a place of possibility versus this playing not to lose or this like safety thing? Fortunately, we did really, really well. And there was a couple people that would commented later, like just changing our mindset had such a huge impact on our behavior and our actions and what we did. I guess the question is, do you think, well, I would be curious where you think the business sector would fall in the 1 to 7. And then the other question is, do you just think the nonprofit world lives in the 4s and 3, whatever, just because that's the culture of conditioning that all the time?
Yeah. Well, the thing I'll say to answer your first question is that because I do coach, like 25% of my clients end up being from outside the nonprofit sector, just from referrals. And I do sort of, regular executive coaching. And there's just a lot of diversity there. So it's not actually that, like, yes, I see more like primary 5s and primary 6s, but I also see more primary 3s, and I see 4 there too. It's just that it's not all the same, which is in my, maybe 98% is the wrong number. In my entire time doing this assessment with nonprofit professionals, only one person has not had 4 as their primary energy level. One person. So it's like, but that is not what I see outside of the nonprofit sector. I think part of it, and I'm curious how this is going to change as I feel like businesses are changing in so many ways, or brands are, becoming about more than their product. I'm curious how it's going to shift kind of where people go in terms of like they graduate college and what's the right space for them. Like, I mentioned, I really felt like the nonprofit sector was where I could make an impact. I went to the University of Michigan. I was really involved in this center there called the Ginsberg Center, where basically I worked in the Detroit public schools and took classes about kind of the, sociology classes about what was happening, what was I seeing. But then I was also in the public schools. And, my guess would be that people who, spend a lot of time in those types of institutions at colleges then go on and work in the nonprofit sector or work in the public sector. And so I feel like there are these feeders around sort of like what you're interested in earlier on. And then what is I never thought of going to business school really until a few years ago. And I was like, maybe I should go back and get my MBA, because I actually think there's this whole thing I'm missing, this whole thing that would have made me a better nonprofit leader. And so I think we're really siloed. And I think in a lot of institutions, we're told like, you want to make money, you go to business school. You have a big heart, go into nonprofit.
Yeah. Actually, I do think that is the right or wrong. And that is the general label, for a lot of people. And I think that right away, you're putting a cap or a limitation on a nonprofit. You're saying, You're going to play in this little space. This is what you're going to do. And you're not going to be able to experience these other things because that's the way it's positioned. And are there any nonprofits out there that you feel like, wow, these are just really bold, adventurous, like burning dogma, breaking rules that you admire?
Yes. I mean, there are so many. I really love the organization She's the First. And they work on, elevating women and girls around the world. And actually the reason that and that is definitely not their mission statement. So we can put the actual mission statement below this. But the reason why they're on my mind so much right now is they just a few months ago now, maybe, came out with a statement around why they stopped sponsoring girls. They essentially kind of shut down an arm of their fundraising model where they used to allow donors to sponsor girls. And so it was just this post on Instagram about why they stopped that practice, how it's actually rooted in, colonialism and white supremacy and all these things. And when I saw it, I was just like, wow, this is, bold and right but fearless in the way they talked about this is the right thing to do. And some of you are going to come along for this and some of you aren't, but it doesn't actually change how important it is that we do this.
Right.
And I think even as I'm watching kind of this reckoning a little bit happening in some areas of the nonprofit sector, moving from donor-centric models of fundraising to community-centric models of fundraising, I think there is this desire to sort of get out of the fear-based scarcity models, believe there are other ways to build organizations, and in recognizing that there's so much kind of looping belief systems. And the one thing I'll say, because you were asking about, kind of the type of person that goes into nonprofit. I do think that there is a lot of stigma around people inside the nonprofit sector too. I have heard so many times throughout my career, oh my gosh, Mallory, you're so capable. You could do anything. Don't you want to go work for Google?
Yeah.
And I was like, what? Like people would be surprised that I was in the nonprofit sector. And I was like, do you know how amazing these people are? How smart and innovative, what they're making happen with $50,000. I would like to see anyone else do it. But there is this stigma about almost like what we used to hear, and maybe some people still hear about teachers, the stigma around, and it's like, where does that come from? And how unbelievably wrong it is.
Yeah, well, actually, on the teacher front, I mean, there's teachers, there's stay-at-home parents. If someone's a stay-at-home parent, it's like you go to a dinner party and there's a bright, shiny object, someone's doing something interesting, and then parents are just trying to raise amazing kids, do all these things. I do think the stigma attached to various things can be pretty debilitating. And even the teacher front, I remember I had this friend who was a teacher, and they're like, I'm just struggling, man. I'm just a teacher. And I'm like, well, what do you do on a daily basis? And they're like, I'm just trying to help these kids grow. And I'm like, great, you're a gardener, maybe just change the perspective how you look at it. But they were living into the stigma that was bestowed on them by culture and society. And I do think it's hard. And so if you can somehow break through that voice of cynicism or judgment or whatever, I'm not at all minimizing how hard that is.
But I think it starts with talking about it even, and just, and internally, there are very few places where I feel like I was even allowed to share that or say, hey, I heard this thing and it was hard. Even with my other nonprofit colleagues, that kind of space wasn't created. And I want to flip the partnership question back on you. Are there cross-sector partnerships that really inspire you?
I guess there's two things. One is I am seeing more and more companies adopt a social impact arm within their businesses, which I think is interesting. And then you're bringing in people who are really good at understanding social impact and generally from nonprofits. So I just think that seems to be becoming more and more predominant. And for some companies, it's bullshit because it's just this like, hey, it's like sustainability. We have a group, we have a social impact. But I'm seeing it done better and better. I like I live here in Ojai, so I'm close to Patagonia. I like the 1% for planet model. I think there's a lot of partners that love that as a badge, and they have 1%. And I think there's value around it. There's probably a lot of them, but that's the one that comes to me just because I know how proud people are to have like the 1% on decal on their store window or whatever it is. And so I think that's a good example where I think it works well. And I don't know the current executive director, I knew the previous one. And I know like he was always like under the kind of like the raise and everything. So it's not, you're trying to find the right partner. So it's just seemed like it was this constant chase. But and then the other one, and I have mixed feelings about it, but I thought Red was like that one in terms of just the scale of the amount of money that was raised. Staggering. Obviously, it was, the goal was to go to a proper cause around HIV and AIDS. But in that, I forget her name, the woman who was leading that. I had one conversation with her. I can tell you flat out, she never lived from a place of scarcity. Her conversation, she was bold and brash, and for some people maybe too much, but I don't think you can discount the value of like what it was in terms of size and scale. And I don't even know where it is in today's world, but that was like, I think an example of one that lived and breathed in a lot of big corporations. Everyone wanted to have a Red campaign during that time here. So, but yeah, those are but I think I have greater affinity for 1%. Just because I like the model in the distribution of funds. Yeah, I love them. I love them too. And I know Kate from my old life. So yeah, they're fantastic. And I want to be really sensitive of time, but I'd love to ask you to share, where people can find you. And if you want to share anything else about Bonfire for the Soul. And then if there is a nonprofit that you would like to highlight for folks to go check out and give if they can. Folks generally can't find me because I'm hiding all the time. I mean, people are like, hey, during COVID, like, what's it like? And I'm like, it's sad because it's tragic and the carnage. But for me personally, I love solitude. So it's great. I live in the hills of Ojai and so that and nestled in nature. So it's been beautiful. But folks can find, I have bonfirewithsoul.com is just, the whole idea there was I thought there could be a new school of thought around business. I half jokingly said I was going to take down or obsolete Harvard Business School. I think it's actually becoming less and less a joke and more serious, but and it's just 12 principles that I've operated under over the last 30 plus years that once again kind of go against the grain of traditional thought and thinking and have worked for me. And so I just, I'm sharing that. And then I'm private on Instagram, but I'm on Twitter, and you could definitely see my left-leaning side. So on Twitter, so I'm not sure everyone will love that. They will if they're listening to this, probably. Okay. Sorry, what was I thought there was one last question. I can't remember what it was. Oh, if there's a nonprofit that you'd like to highlight. So the Biomimicry Institute for me is just one of the. I just think nature, for 3.8 billion years, there's been this mentor for us, and we can adopt life's principles and how nature would operate. And so I always ask, when people say, what should we do? I'm always like, ask nature. And Biomimicry Institute is doing just really brilliant work. Beth Ratner, who's up in Marin, who's the executive director, has just done a remarkable job. And so Biomimicry Institute, if you haven't seen it, or go to asknature.org And I think you can find out a lot of cool things. So
amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope everyone will go check out Bonfire with Soul. I think it is a course I wish I had taken when I was running a nonprofit too. There's so much. I mean, it's going to change my business dramatically. Some of the principles that you talk about have just been mind-blowing. So thank you for all of that.
Mallory, my pleasure. And you just have been a gift to myself and my family over the years. So thank you. And I'm just really excited for what you're up to. I actually think you turning the world upside down and waking up the neighborhood around this is going to be just such a breath of fresh air. So, and I wish you the best on this.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you. Is Duke just one of the most amazing humans you've ever met, or what? The way he talks about business and nonprofits and what's possible when we work together and grow and push ourselves to be better, it really inspires me so much around my own business and around the nonprofits that I get to work with every single day. I hope this episode made you get curious about the fundamental differences and where things are about structural differences versus mindset differences. I really believe that so much of what holds us back inside the nonprofit sector are old school mindsets about what's possible and what's not. And I think we can move from desperation to inspiration using some of the tools and practices and principles that Duke teaches us about. There were so many takeaways from this episode. So head on over to MalloryErickson.com/podcast for the detailed show notes with all the top tips and tricks and links to other resources from my 15 years of fundraising. You'll find more information about Duke there as well, and a link to Bonfire with Soul. Most importantly, thank you for spending this time with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would give it a rating, review, share it with a friend. I'm so grateful for my listeners, especially you, and the good, hard work you're doing to improve our world every single day. And if you miss me between episodes, stop by and say hello on Instagram under @whatthefundraising_. Have a great day, and I'll see you next week.